Hello, welcome to a new episode of Germany in Focus, a podcast made possible by members of The Local. Today we're sharing details about former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's memoir. We're talking about why German politicians are flocking to TikTok and why the far-right party Alternative for Germany is so successful on social media. A row that started over the forceful removal of a pro-Palestinian student protest camp at a Berlin university has escalated, with Germany's biggest newspaper getting involved. We'll hear from a journalist who's been covering the story and break down what's going on there. And finally, we'll put the spotlight on the city of Cologne and talk about some interesting facts and how to visit on a budget. I'm Rachel Loxton, and I'm in Berlin today with journalist Paul Krantz and Imogen Goodman. Hi.
Hi.
How are you both?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Yeah, I'm doing well as well.
Yeah. Good week?
Yeah, good week. So I went to the Spargel Fest in Schöneberg over the weekend.
Wait, so you went to an asparagus festival?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, I will say that a big motive for me going was us talking about it recently on the podcast, talking about Spargel and all the excitement around it. So I thought I should do my duty as a resident in Germany and get out there and try the goods. And I went to this fest. I should say it's kind of a small Spargel Fest here in Schöneberg in Berlin. So it's not like a big Spargel Fest out in Bielitz or somewhere where they farm a lot of the vegetable. So it's just kind of a small like city fair. But I was really disappointed at the lack of Spargel on the scene. There was like two booths, I think, serving up some Spargel soup and like roasted Spargel with some potatoes or whatever. But yeah, I don't know what I expected, but I definitely expected a lot more asparagus on the scene.
It's not quite the bombastic celebration of asparagus that you want. I think you do need to go to Bielitz for that, as you mentioned. I haven't been to Bielitz, or I have, but only in winter. Don't go then.
Interesting.
Go in Spargelzeit.
Okay.
Another kind of disappointed trip to a Spargel-based area. Yeah, go in spring. It's the best.
They had some Flammkuchen that
Yeah.
I was thinking about. This is like, I call it like a German pizza, almost like a German pancake kind of pizza thing. But the amount of Spargel on the Flammkuchen was dismal. So I was like, okay, I'm not doing that. And the other dishes were a little more expensive and I was already kind of full. So in the end, I just passed on all of it.
Oh, that's kind of sad. So you didn't get any Spargel?
Well, I did. I ate green asparagus at home, but I still haven't had the white asparagus that the Germans are so crazy for this time of year.
You've never tried it?
I mean, I've tried it once or twice, but not this season.
Can I just... Right. Every Spargelzeit is a renewal of sorts. You need to start again with your relationship with Spargel.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Okay, well, I love how every time we start a podcast now, we have to talk about Spargel, at least right during Spargelzeit.
Yeah,
so,
for like 2 or 3 more weeks at least.
yeah, so maybe you will finally have some this season, Paul.
I
You
hope
never
so.
know.
Yeah.
Angela Merkel hasn't been on our radar for a while. Of course, she stepped down from politics back in 2021 after 16 years as Chancellor of Germany. But the Christian Democrat has been in the news this week because there's a memoir about her life coming out soon. This week, we found out some more details. Imogen, what can we expect from Merkel's tell-all book?
Well, yeah, we're hoping it's going to be tell-all, at least. And there is understandably huge excitement and anticipation around this. Merkel, I think everyone knows, is something of a closed book. She always keeps her cards quite close to her chest. So a lot of people, I think, are very much hoping that they're going to be able to peek behind the curtain and see a bit more of who she is as a person and kind of the workings of her inner world. So as you can imagine, these memoirs are going to deal extensively with the 16 years that Merkel spent as Chancellor of Germany. So her conversations, her meetings with some of the world's most powerful and influential people, the major political events of our time and of her time, both in Germany and abroad, and some of the role that she played in shaping these big decisions during her time in office and the reasoning behind some of those decisions. So Merkel's actually co-writing the book with her longtime political advisor, Beate Baumann. So we can definitely expect a lot of juicy political details, I think, for anyone who's particularly fascinated by that side of her life. But it does sound like there's going to be a lot more of an intimate look at her life as well. So drawing on her childhood, growing up in the DDR, her time studying chemistry, the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, her meteoric and rather astounding and unlikely rise in politics, and the personal ideas and passions that drive her as a person and a politician. So Merkel is actually turning 70 this year, and the publishers of the memoirs sort of note that her life can be kind of neatly divided into this 35 years in the DDR and the 35 years in a reunited Germany. But the book will only kind of chart her life up to the time she left office when she retired in 2021. The other thing to know about it is that it's set to be a pretty hefty tome. It's apparently 720 pages long, and the title is very simple. It's called Freedom, Memories 1954 to 2021.
Sounds super interesting, to be
Definitely.
honest. Has Merkel said anything about it?
Yeah, there's a pretty interesting quote from Merkel that has been circulated in press releases that were announcing the publication date of these memoirs. And it really relates to this freedom title of the book. So Merkel actually said that she's been occupied with this issue of freedom and the question of what freedom is and what it means her whole life, both in a kind of political sense, in championing democracy and in contrast to her life in the DDR perhaps, but also in a personal sense. And she says that for her, freedom means finding out where her limits lie, pushing her own boundaries. She says, for me, freedom is not to stop learning, not to have to stand still, but to be allowed to go further even after leaving politics. So that's kind of interesting. It's interesting to hear her explicitly referencing both this personal sense and this political sense. So the promise seems to be that she's going to reveal much more of her inner thoughts and personality in this book, which, as I say, is something she kept fairly well concealed during her time in politics.
Yeah, wow. I would love to hear what she really thinks about things.
Yeah.
Because she kept that out of the public, didn't she?
She had such a poker face, and
totally.
I think this is, now she, I guess, feels that she's able to share those things. She's far enough removed from her time in politics to do that. So I'm excited as well, actually, if you can't tell.
Yeah. When is it going to be released then? And will it just be in German?
So we do still have to wait a while for this book to come out. The publication date isn't until November 26th, so sort of in time for the Christmas book sales. But I have seen that you can actually pre-order your copy online already. So there's some major booksellers that I shall not name stocking it. The German and the English version, so there's two versions, both set to come out on this same date. So you do have the option of reading it in whatever language you feel more comfortable in. One thing to mention, though, is that it will be quite pricey. If you buy it as soon as it comes out in this hardback copy, that will set you back 42 euros.
42
euros? A decent chunk of money there. But 720 pages, I don't know, that's maybe not a bad
How big is that? Is that like the Bible kind of size?
It's like one of the early Harry Potters.
Yeah,
Really?
one of the later Harry Potters.
It's
a late Harry Potter, yeah.
What, like a brick?
It's pretty pretty thick.
Yeah.
It's about probably the size of my palm.
Okay, wow. Okay, so maybe
You're making everyone think I've got big palms.
I just was shocked because I've never heard of a book costing nearly, over 40 euros.
Yeah, they know that people are going to buy it because, as I say,
she's going to make a mint.
Yeah.
So it's been a few years since Merkel left office and a lot has changed. How do you think she feels about the way things have been going? And do you think she's fondly remembered in Germany?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question and a slightly complicated one to answer because I think there are several different ways to kind of view her legacy. Obviously, when she retired, there was still a real sense that she was beloved of everyone, or at least liked and admired by everyone. I would say in the meantime, one thing that's definitely happened is that the legacy has become massively tainted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the fact that this has kind of forced Germany to reassess its years of, if not necessarily cozying up to Vladimir Putin, certainly growing a dependence on Russia, being rather naive perhaps about the reliability of this trading partner and the German-Russian relationship. So on Merkel's watch, Germany massively increased its dependence on cheap Russian gas, even after Putin had annexed Crimea back in 2014. This, of course, put the country in a massive bind when it came to taking a tough line on the full-scale invasion that came later. So this is something that's really harmed her legacy. And she's also been criticised for not really expanding renewable energy in that time. And this is something that the current government is still struggling with today, struggling to build out those renewables and new energy sources. So I did read a rather scathing commentary on NTV today, just after the book was announced. And the author actually pointed out that the memoirs aren't really the only Merkel book that's set to appear this year. So at the end of October, interesting timing, about a month before this one comes out, there's also a critical biography of Merkel by East German author Klaus Rudinger-May titled Angela Merkel, Between Legend and Reality. So it seems like that will offer a rather different view of Merkel's 16 years. So this author talks about her disastrous energy transition, dependence on Russia, misguided migration policy, dismantling of democracy, restriction of civil rights, the collapse of the healthcare system. I could go on. So it's interesting, really, to note that there is a very critical view of her now that people are airing. It's interesting also to see that the CDU is now moving in a very different direction with Friedrich Merz, and particularly in a very different direction on migration policy. That said, I don't want to be too one-sided here. I'm sure there are many people in Germany who still do look back fondly at her time, and particularly that kind of sense of stability she seemed to offer.
Yeah, totally. I wasn't living here for much of Merkel's time in power, but from talking to Germans and asking their opinions on her, I generally get the sense that what I would say the majority of Germans think is that she was kind of okay. Which to me as an American is kind of a crazy thought, right? Because if you look at American politics today, it's so divisive. You're either with this guy or you're with that guy. And if you're with that guy, you hate this guy, or vice versa, right? Whereas I feel like a lot of Germans have criticism for Merkel, but they also say, yeah, she did, a decent job, which is not something the majority of Americans would say about any of our recent presidents, I think.
Thank you so much for that. Speaking of German politicians, we're going to focus on their social media habits now. A few high-profile figures have been getting on the platform TikTok recently. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, joined in April. Robert Habeck, the Vice Chancellor, is on there too. And Karl Lauterbach, the Health Minister, has also started posting. But what are the reasons behind these mainstream politicians coming on to TikTok? Paul, can you tell us why German politicians are seemingly upping their game on social media?
Yeah, well, in short, it's basically a bid to try to connect with young voters. So Robert Habeck actually said as much himself when he announced he was joining TikTok. He said he wanted to meet young people, quote, where they are. And as you mentioned, he got on the app just after Chancellor Scholz, who hopes that the platform will allow Germany's government to reach more people who are curious about politics. So this all comes after research was published somewhat recently that basically showed how big the far-right AfD party reach has become on social media and how far behind some of the other parties are. So a media analysis conducted by a German political consultant found that in 2022 and 2023, the average AfD post, meaning posts from like the official AfD parliamentary group TikTok account, got around 430,000 impressions, just on average for all their posts across those 2 years. No other party had comparable reach on the platform. The FDP was the runner-up party. That's the Free Democrats. And they had just over 50,000 impressions on average. So that reach does come with some significant political influence. We know that at least a quarter of people from the ages 13 to 24 say social media is their primary source for news, and I've actually seen higher numbers than that in other polls. So politicians are basically waking up to the fact that social media apps, and that means TikTok first and foremost at the moment, offer the best and most direct channels to reach a large group of voters, young voters namely.
Why has the AfD been so successful on TikTok, do you think? And what is the effect of this?
Yeah, I think there's at least two key factors here to understanding the AfD's TikTok success. First, they were early adapters of the app. So prominent AfD leaders started posting regularly on TikTok really early on, like right when the app kind of blew up as a place to share information. And so they've had a couple years of a head start in growing their audience there. And it's also worth mentioning that they were early adopters on YouTube and Telegram, other social media apps, and they've also had success there. But secondly, I think it's fair to say that this kind of populist content, by virtue of being so controversial, is really rewarded by these social media algorithms and therefore is kind of promoted more. So we could look at Maximilian Krah, the AfD's top candidate in the upcoming Euro elections, and he's been particularly good at producing viral TikTok hits. By the way, we mentioned Krah like a week or two ago because his aide was recently arrested on suspicions of being a spy for China, but I digress. Krah's videos are short and quickly edited, so they fit well in the TikTok kind of world. And he uses simple language to deliver these poignant messages that are often designed to be triggering, I would say. So as an example, in one video, he starts by saying that 1 in 3 young men has never had a girlfriend. And then he ends with, "Don't let anyone tell you you have to be nice. Real men are right wing." And that video got over 1 million views.
My goodness.
Yeah, so you can imagine how that's quite triggering for a lot of people who come across that. Now, we could compare that to one of Chancellor Scholz's early posts in which he gives a minute-long interview about his favorite briefcase and the kinds of things he carries around in it.
I kind of enjoyed that one.
I did too. I mean, it was, what can I say about it? It's like mild, but...
It's cute.
Yeah. But you can imagine it's not going to kind of elicit the response that makes you maybe want to share it with someone or comment an angry response. It's
not like clickbait.
Exactly. And I guess it is worth mentioning that the Chancellor does get millions of views on his videos. I guess that comes with being, the most powerful man in Germany at the moment. But I think the SPD more generally and a lot of these other political parties still have a long way to go before they can catch up with the influence of the AfD on that platform.
For sure. And yeah, like you, Paul, I took a look at some videos that the AfD were posting, and they were calling for things like to limit benefits for foreigners. And there was another one talking about how the fight against the far right is undemocratic. And I saw there was a lot of support in the comments, a lot of people posting Germany flags and things like that.
Sure. I mean, we shouldn't forget that the AfD has been steadily polling around 20% in Germany for some time. And 20% of 80 million people is a pretty big number. So there's definitely a lot of voices out there to comment supportively for the AfD. And we should also be aware that it is easy on the app to delete or hide comments on your own content. So it's very likely that political groups are kind of silencing or hiding criticism that might otherwise appear higher up in the comments. But another known hazard of social media is that users tend to end up in these kind of information echo chambers, where you're more likely to see content from people or groups that kind of confirm your own beliefs. And it's known with people, especially for people with fringe beliefs, like on the far right or also on the far left. These people kind of gather amongst themselves in these corners of the internet, and it ends up kind of radicalizing people even further.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting timing, though, isn't it, that these politicians are going on TikTok, because there are concerns in the West about the app that's owned by a Chinese company. We've heard talk of TikTok being banned in the US. What do you think people think about it in Europe?
Yeah, so just to clarify, there are restrictions on the app in certain states in the US, but the bigger kind of so-called TikTok ban that we're hearing about is basically just that the parent company called ByteDance will have to sell the app to a US-based company to continue operations there. Mm-hmm. However, there's reason to believe that the company might refuse to sell it or be unable to sell it, in which case the app would eventually not be accessible in the App Store. So they can't really stop you from seeing TikTok on your own phone, but if you buy a new phone or you go to update it or something, it won't be there. And so this would effectively kill the app over time, is the idea. In Europe, TikTok is currently being investigated by the EU Commission for possible breaches of EU law. And EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently said in a debate that the EU ban of TikTok is not out of the question. So we could see the EU trying to kind of follow suit along those lines. But I think both in Europe and the US, this idea of a TikTok ban is a pretty divisive issue. And we have people who are not on the app who tend also to be older, who tend to be more in favor of regulation or even this outright ban. Whereas we have a lot of people who are on the app who tend to be younger that are saying, this is really an offensive kind of restriction on freedom of speech and freedom of sharing information. And furthermore, I think most of the arguments against TikTok could and maybe should also be applied to other social media companies, Facebook, Instagram, for example, which have been allowed to operate in the US and Europe largely unrestricted for years.
Thanks so much for that, Paul. Like in some other countries, Germany has been seeing students setting up pro-Palestinian protest camps, which have in some cases led to forceful removal of protesters by police. But the situation at Berlin's Freie Universität, or Free University, has escalated after police brutally evicted a protest camp last week by students. Around 300 lecturers at the university signed an open letter supporting the students' right to protest. Then Germany's biggest selling newspaper, Bild, printed pictures of lecturers who signed the letter and suggested they were perpetrators. I spoke to journalist James Jackson, who has been looking into the story. James, can you help explain what is going on here?
I would say this is just the latest chapter in quite a long-running conflict in German society that's really picked up since the 7th of October Hamas massacre in Israel and the Israeli counterattack. Germany is, of course, sees itself historically as very much on the side of Israel because of the Holocaust, but it's also home to a large Palestinian population. And there are many, of course, students, some of whom are international, who have expressed deep concerns about Israel's military actions in Gaza, whether they're proportionate, and some who question the very existence of Israel itself as a settler colonial project. Now, many of these camps have existed in Berlin, or protests and camps, but there has been some very heavy policing of it. And there's a lot of legal battles about what is legal, what's not. The phrase that in question is often from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which Berlin police are treating as illegal, despite a number of courts in other states ruling it as legal. It's considered to be a sign of a terrorist movement here, which is Hamas, despite the slogan itself existing for decades before Hamas. Now, what's interesting about this, I think this at Free University, there was an eviction. And then what happened was the lecturers actually signed a public letter saying, we should talk to our students. This is a place of academic dialogue. Now, for this eviction to happen, actually the leadership of the Free University called the police on their own students. And so they've been heavily criticized for that. And the lecturers criticized the leadership. What happened next, I think, is a new chapter in this conflict and how it's reflecting on German streets, which is that not just the protesters themselves, but lecturers who signed a public letter for academic freedom and freedom of speech on campus have now been targeted. So I think that caused a lot of backlash, actually, because the lecturers can say, listen, we don't necessarily agree with all of the protests. We don't agree with the illegal phrases like from the river to the sea. But this is a university. This is not somewhere, and particularly with Germany's history of the Nazis' control and the communists controlling the universities, they would have the right to say that we need to be really careful with getting the police involved on campus for political speech. But Bild posted some pictures of these, many of them, and said, supporters of Jew hate demonstrations, which I think, is probably a bit of an exaggeration there. And many of the lecturers would feel like they've been put in danger. Now, actually, there's a long history of this in Germany with the student movement in the 60s and 70s being targeted by Bild with similar language. This was the leftist kind of anti-Nazi student movement. And one of the main leaders, Rudi Dutschke, was actually a victim of an assassination attempt, which seriously injured him and later caused his death. But of course, the fact that they were targeting lecturers has caused a bit of backlash because these are not Palestinians, these are not, leftist students, these are respected lecturers. And I think also including this was also an article before this by Bild was shared by the Education Minister, Bettina Stark-Watzinger from the FDP. And there was also questions of why is she sharing an attack on lecturers? Isn't it her job to defend lecturers?
Yeah, I mean, why would Build be publishing pictures of the teaching staff in this way? And like, what has the reaction been from the university on this?
It's hard to know exactly, but many of what Build were wanting to do, but many of the lecturers themselves felt that this was an intimidation technique. So this was to sort of make them famous, make them infamous, and to make them question whether they would be signing any public letters again. That may have had some success, but I think it's also fair to say that this is probably the incident which has had the biggest backlash in the entire conflict and how it's working, the entire Middle East conflict and how it's working out in Germany. So the universities themselves hit back at Build, saying that they are looking at suing them effectively. They condemned this attempt, and they also criticized, to varying degrees of severity, the education minister herself for attacking lecturers. Nevertheless, a lot of the lecturers who I've spoken to are still worried that this is going to have severe implications for their career, maybe some kind of unofficial blacklist, because in Germany, you don't want to be associated with anti-Semitism or Jew hatred or even controversy. In my view, it's a society where people who are considered controversial are often avoided, and that's not great if you're trying to make a career in the public sector.
James, obviously the topic of Israel is a very tricky one for Germany, given the history, as you've mentioned, and we've talked about it a lot previously on this podcast. Do you see this kind of view that anyone criticizing Israel or the Israeli government is anti-Semitic softening in Germany anytime soon? Or like, do you think there will be more nuance on this? Or do you think it will continue with this very, very hard line?
I think that's a good question. And I think this could potentially be a tipping point. But the thing is, it's a little bit more abstract because the lecturers didn't actually criticize the Israeli government themselves. But since then, as a result of the backlash, I do think we've seen a little bit more of a nuanced conversation, a bit more of a conversation about what are the boundaries, what are the acceptable boundaries of discourse, with more moderate figures getting involved in that and saying even, this sort of slightly strange chain of abstraction where you have the students protesting and then you have the lecturer saying, we don't agree with the protest, but we agree with the right to do it. And then part of the backlash has been people saying, I don't agree with the letter, but I agree with their right to write the letter. So I think that's been quite interesting to see. I do think that this could be a bit of a tipping point because German society is one which respects academic knowledge and academic titles and positions quite a lot. So we're seeing a sort of more populist force, the Build, against a more academic force of lecturers here. And I think it's interesting to see who will win in that sense. I think Build probably did overstep the mark there because they used some because they did touch a nerve by reminding people of their role in the students' movement and some violence against student leaders there. So I do think we are potentially seeing a softening here, but anything could happen, and Germany might just ignore this and continue. A lot of it also depends on the US, I think, and international law.
So these student protests in Germany have stemmed from the US, right, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that this can all be traced back to Columbia University in New York, where in April, a student protest encampment had sprung up, and the school board basically called the police to evict them, and it led to some pretty brutal evictions there. And since then, similar protest camps have kind of spread through universities across the country, and then now they've really gone worldwide as well, including a protest in Amsterdam that got heated very recently. Also, this protest at the FU University here in Berlin and other universities across Germany. By the way, back in the US, this is still going on. It's still a pretty big thing. According to the New York Times' latest figures, more than 2,800 students or people have been arrested on campuses in the US for these. Biden has responded with somewhat vague statements like, quote, dissent is essential for democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder. Or there's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos. These are a few things he said about them. Many protesters, on the other hand, contend that these encampments are really by themselves usually quite peaceful. And the majority of chaos that I think we've seen in the US is always happening in response to police coming in violently to evict people.
Imogen, you studied at the Free University. How did you feel seeing the protests last week?
Yeah, to be honest, I found the whole situation really upsetting, especially seeing these videos of young students, possibly even teenagers, young people being so violently handled by police simply for trying to stage a demonstration. From some of the videos, which are really incredibly hard to watch, it really doesn't seem like the police were using much restraint at all when it came to disbanding this kind of makeshift encampment. As Paul mentioned, it really feels like quite the opposite. What is really ironic is that this university is called Free University. It was set up in 1948 under the American Allied Forces as a distinct alternative to the Soviet-run university in the east of the city, and as a counterpoint to the persecution faced by students there who dared to speak out against the system. So I'm not saying that this is anywhere near that kind of systematic persecution necessarily, but Free University has also had a very deep connection with student protest movements over the years. And not far from where the encampment was set up is a street called Rudi Dutschke-Weg, obviously named after the most famous figure in the 1960s student protest movement in Germany. So it feels like this kind of thing very much cuts against this proud history that the name is meant to suggest of intellectual freedom and the right to dissent. And that championing freedom of expression has kind of been forgotten here, which really has tainted the reputation of the university somewhat.
Yeah, really good point. What is the feeling among students? Have there been communications from university managers or lecturers?
Yeah, well, obviously, as we've heard, a lot of students, as well as faculty members and a few of my lecturers actually have signed the open letter criticising that response to the protest and, of course, highlighting the importance of the right to protest and freedom of speech. It did take a while for the university itself to kind of formally respond to this. But earlier this week, on Monday 13th, the university's executive board sent out a statement kind of half explaining their actions, their response to the attempted sit-in occupation, and mostly kind of calling for an open dialogue, a respectful discussion and debate around the conflict in the Middle East and the problematic issues surrounding it. They claimed that the student occupation was unauthorized, that they had safety concerns for both the teachers and the students. They weren't sure they could protect anyone in this kind of makeshift occupation. So they said they wanted to shut it down and evacuate the area as quickly as possible. That was kind of their explanation and what they said they were prioritizing. They also did respond to the open letter from the teachers. They said they took their concerns very seriously. They were seeking out conversations with those faculty members who had signed the letter. And they mention, of course, Bild Zeitung. In fact, they mention them twice, describing the reporting of the demo itself, but also of the letter as libelous, and saying that they condemned that in the strongest words. So the statement kind of ended quite sweetly. They called for the university community to come together, to engage in dialogue, to address our differences, while also avoiding discriminatory practices and language, not excluding anyone.
Thank you for the updates there. Okay, guys, so we're finishing off today with a chat about the city of Cologne, or Cologne. So Cologne is in the western state of North Rhine-Westphalia. It dates back around 2,000 years, making it one of Germany's oldest cities. So there's a ton of history to find out about there. It has a population of around 1.5 million, and over 36% of the city is made up of people with a migrant background. So it attracts a lot of foreign residents as well, including a few of our listeners. Do you guys have a fact about this lovely city to share?
Yes, I do. And there are some really cool, quirky facts about Cologne. It's generally just quite a quirky city, I think.
I agree.
The carnival and stuff. But I feel like I should probably stick with the sausage theme that we started a few podcasts ago and mention that the first soy-based sausage was actually invented here by none other than Konrad Adenauer, the first ever Chancellor of Germany.
Wait, what?
No way.
Yeah.
What is it? That's so random.
That's shocking,
It's incredible. It's incredible. It all feels so modern. But actually, this happened during World War I in 1917. And at the time, Adenauer was serving as mayor of Cologne. And he cooked up the idea for this sausage, partly as a way to combat the dire food shortages on the Western Front, the high cost of pork that had skyrocketed during the war, but also, by his own admission, as a way to encourage people to eat a more plant-based diet, it just feels very 2024.
He was ahead of his time.
It really does, yeah. And so I do have to say it wasn't fully vegetarian, but it just had sort of less meat than a normal sausage. And he sort of filled it out by using a high-protein soy powder, which again feels very, very modern today. So this lovely sausage was branded the Friedenswurst, or the peace sausage. And unfortunately, he never managed to get it patented in Germany, but he did manage to secure a patent in neighbouring Austria and also in the UK for his peace sausage. So well done, Adenauer.
Wow.
Ahead of his time.
That is the most random fact I've ever heard. What was Konrad Adenauer doing at home experimenting with how to make sausages?
It's incredible. There's a lot about him that I didn't know. But apparently he was quite influenced by the East, kind of by the Far East, and he kind of learned there that not everything has to be pork and potatoes, which is whisper it.
Wow.
So he was definitely a very interesting character, and love him for inventing the Friedenswurst.
Is that like still available anywhere? Do you know?
That's a really good question, and I do not know. I should have looked that up. If we find a place to get it, we will definitely share that.
Yeah, we'll look
as soon as we can.
So do you have anything that can top that, Paul?
I cannot top that.
Yeah.
I'll just admit that right off the bat.
Me neither.
But as a beer enthusiast, I was interested to learn this fun fact about Cologne's classic beer style, which is Kolsch, which I actually enjoy. Kolsch gets some people really dislike Kolsch. They say it's like flavorless and bland, whatever. It's a light beer. It's a good summer beer.
So like a Pils?
Yeah. It's a very light, like pale ale. So anyway, I learned that Kolsch is actually limited to the region of Cologne. So it's only produced in 13 breweries around Cologne, and it's not allowed to be brewed outside of the region. So I guess it's kind of like the champagne of beers. Like if it's not from Cologne, it's just sparkling pale ale.
It's just Coors Light.
But yeah, I've only stopped off in Cologne very briefly on like a layover, so to speak, a train layover. So I just stepped out of the station and walked around a little bit. But I really would like to go there for Carnival. I had a classmate who had come from Cologne and was always telling me that it was like one of the best parties in Germany.
Awesome.
Yeah, Carnival is great. I haven't been to the Carnival there, but I have been in that region. I would also love to go.
In Dusseldorf or Mainz?
Dusseldorf, yeah. I just visited Cologne when I was young, so I need to go back as an adult. So my fact, I'm going to stick with the eating and drinking theme. So one of the local delicacies of Cologne is the halve Hahn, which means half a chicken, but it's not meat. Wait, it feels like we're...
Don't tell me it's soy-based.
No, this is I don't know how we managed
to... vegan Han.
I don't know how we managed to have almost the same fact, kind of, but without a chancellor. So despite the name, it is completely meat-free. It's totally unrelated to a chicken. The dish is a rye bread roll and a slab of Gouda cheese.
You know what that reminds me of? Now you're talking about it, it really reminds me of a Welsh rabbit. Right? Which is kind of... So you think it's a rabbit dish. It's not. It's just cheese on toast.
What?
It's the same. It's
this is
the
all
same
news
thing.
to me.
Yeah.
This is so
Europeans
good.
have the craziest names for cheese and bread.
Yeah. Yeah. Apparently this name, okay, I don't know for certain. Maybe if someone is listening, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but apparently it come from like a groom back in the day having a wedding and he'd said to everyone that there would be halve a Hahn, half a chicken, but then he ran out of money and he gave them a bread roll and cheese.
And he just styled it out. He just said, "No, this is a halve a Hahn.
Yeah.
This is a halve. What are you talking about? What did you think
Everybody
it was?"
calls it that.
Yeah, and I respect that.
And now they do.
Do you have any tips if you're heading to Cologne for a weekend break and you don't want to spend too much money?
Well, as I said earlier, I've not been far outside the train station in Cologne, but it's worth noting the Cologne Cathedral, or the Kölner Dom, is right there by the central train station, and that is quite a sight. So even if you have very limited time, you could just step outside and see that. And beer is always cheap, so if you're on a budget trip, you can try some of the local Kolsch.
100%.
Yeah, so for me, I think I have been to Cologne a bit more recently, and I would say I think anyone on a budget, and actually even those who aren't on a budget, should definitely go to visit the Rhine Park in Cologne, which, as the name suggests, is a beautiful park right on the banks of the River Rhine. There is so much to do and see in this park. There are playgrounds, there's a skate park, water features, a rose garden cafe. So it's just a wonderful place to kind of stroll around and soak up the atmosphere. So on a sunny day, I'd highly recommend taking some food, some sect, and enjoying a lovely picnic there with views of the Rhine River and the famous Cologne Cathedral, of course.
Absolutely stunning. So for exploring Cologne on a budget, I'd suggest checking out a Bütchen or kiosk for a quick meal. Pico Coffee is a favorite, apparently. It sells breakfast, sandwiches, crepes, and other snacks. We do have a really nice article on this by our colleague Mike Stutchbury on doing Cologne on a budget. So we will include that in the show notes. That's it for this week. Thank you so much to all our listeners. As always, we will add all the links in the show notes for the stories we've been talking about today. It would really mean a lot to us if you hit follow, left a rating or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This week's panelists have been Imogen Goodman and Paul Krantz. We also heard from journalist James Jackson, and our sound engineer is Rhys Edwards. I'm Rachel Loxton. We hope you enjoyed listening, and we'll be back again next week. Until then, take care.